People always wondered why Frank Sinatra allowed Deanmartin to make fun of him on stage. If you watch the old tapes of the Rat Pack at the Sands, you see it. Frank was the chairman of the board. He snapped his fingers and presidents jumped. He had a temper so volatile that waiters shook when they poured his coffee. Nobody insulted Frank Sinatra, but Dean would walk onto that stage holding a cigarette and a drink and destroy Frank. He would flick cigarette ash on Frank's tuxedo. He would push him aside. He would mock his singing, his height, his love life. And Frank would just stand there and laugh. He would look at Dean with pure adoration. It was the look of a younger brother gazing up at his hero. Why? Why did the most powerful man in show business let Deanmartin get away with murder? The answer lies in a single freezing night in 1952, the night Frank Sinatra hit rock bottom. The night the music stopped and the voice was ready to silence itself forever. It was the night Frank knelt on the floor of a lonely apartment ready to die, and Deanmartin was the only hand that reached down into the abyss to pull him up. Frank didn't just owe Dean his friendship, Frank Sinatra owed Deanmartin his life. To understand that night, we have to strip away the legend. We have to forget the Frank Sinatra of My Way in New York, New York. We have to go back to 1952, the year the world forgot. In the 1940s, Frank had been a god. He was the voice. He made Bobby Soxers faint, but fame is a cruel mistress. By 1950, she had found a new lover. Post-war America was changing. The sweet ballads that made Frank famous were going out of style. Then, tragedy struck. Frank's voice began to fail him. It happened at the Copacabana in New York. Frank was on stage reaching for a high note, and his throat simply closed, a vocal cord hemorrhage. He opened his mouth and nothing came out but a dry rasp. It wasn't just a missed note, it was the sound of a career dying. The press turned on him like wolves. The headlines were brutal. Frankie finished. The voice is silenced. His record label dropped him. His agent dropped him. MGM Studios fired him. He was a pariah. And while Frank was falling, Dean was rising. Dean and Jerry Lewis were the biggest act in the world. Every time Frank opened a newspaper, he saw Dean's face. The jealousy must have eaten him alive. But the career failure was only half the story. The real poison in Frank's veins had a name: Ava Gardner. Frank didn't just love Ava, he was consumed by her. She was the most beautiful woman in the world, a femme fatale who drank as hard as Frank, cursed as hard as Frank, and fought as hard as Frank. He left his wife and children for her. He destroyed his family man image for her. And she tortured him. Their relationship was a violent, toxic hurricane. Ava was independent. She wouldn't be owned. And Frank, a man who needed to own everything, couldn't handle it. By 1952, with his career in ruins, Frank became desperate. Ava began to pull away. The breakups were legendary. Frank would threaten suicide. He would overdose on pills, calling friends at the last minute to save him. It was a cry for help from a man who had lost his identity. But on this particular night in late 1952, it wasn't a cry for help. It was silence. Ava was in Africa filming. She wasn't answering his calls. Frank was in New York alone. He had no gigs, he had no money, he had no voice, and he believed he had no future. The apartment was cold. Frank sat on the edge of the bed in an undershirt and slacks. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. The apartment was littered with empty bottles and unread scripts for terrible movies he couldn't even audition for. He looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. The blue eyes were dull. The cheeks were hollow. "You're nothing," the voice in his head whispered. "You're a joke." He walked to the kitchen. He looked at the gas oven. Some say he had a gun. Some say pills. But the most pervasive story is the gas. It was a quiet way to go. Just sleep. Frank turned the knob. Hiss. He sat on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He closed his eyes. He thought about his kids. He thought about Ava. He thought about the applause he would never hear again. The world didn't need Frank Sinatra anymore. Minutes passed. The smell of gas filled the kitchen. Frank's head began to swim. He felt the darkness closing in, and then a sound cut through the haze. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was pounding on the door. Frank ignored it. He didn't want to be saved. Bang, bang, bang. "Frankie, open the damn door." The voice was familiar. Dean. Frank tried to stand, but his legs were weak. Then, crash. The door exploded inward. Deanmartin had kicked it off its hinges. Dean didn't say hello. He smelled the gas instantly. He rushed into the kitchen. He turned the knobs off. He threw open the window, letting freezing air rush in. Frank was slumped in the hallway, coughing, crying, a broken, sobbing heap. Dean grabbed Frank by the shoulders and hauled him up. He dragged him to the sofa and threw him down. "What the hell are you doing?" Dean asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was terrified. But Deanmartin never showed terror. He masked it with cool. "I'm done, Dee," Frank sobbed. "It's over. She's gone. The voice is gone. I got nothing." Dean looked around the squalid apartment. He realized how close he had come to reading his friend's obituary. Dean found a bottle of whiskey. He poured 2 glasses. He handed one to Frank. "Drink," Dean commanded. Frank took the glass with shaking hands. The liquor burned his throat, waking him up. Dean sat on the coffee table directly across from Frank. He lit a cigarette and handed it to him. "You ain't done, Dee," Dean said quietly. "Look at me," Frank screamed. "I'm a bum. I'm borrowing money to buy dinner. MGM won't let me on the lot. I'm a punchline." "So what?" Dean shrugged. "You think you're the first guy to take a beating? I shoveled coal in Steubenville. I dealt cards to murderers for $5 a night. Being broke ain't a death sentence. It's just a Tuesday." "It's different for you," Frank argued. "I'm supposed to be the voice. Without that, I'm nobody." Dean leaned forward. This was the turning point. "You're Frank Sinatra," Dean said with conviction. "You're the best singer God ever put on this earth. Yeah, maybe your pipes are rusty. Maybe you got a broken heart, but you're still Frank." "Ava," Frank whispered. "Forget Ava. She's a hurricane. You can't hold on to a hurricane. Let her go. You got to get back in the ring." Frank looked at Dean. He saw something he hadn't seen in anyone else's eyes in years. Respect. Dean didn't pity him. Dean believed in him. Dean pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a check. "Here," Dean said. "Pay the rent. Buy a suit. Get a shave. You look like hell." Frank looked at the check. "I don't want your money, Dean. It ain't a gift," Dean said. "It's a loan. You're going to pay me back with interest." "How?" "I can't get a job." "You get a job. Stop feeling sorry for yourself and fight. There's a movie, right? That war movie." "From Here to Eternity," Frank muttered. "They don't want me. Make them want you. Beg if you have to. Fight for it. Work for nothing. Just get the part. Because once you're on that screen, they're going to remember." Dean stayed all night. They drank the whole bottle. They talked about the old days. Dean made jokes until Frank finally cracked a smile. Deanmartin didn't perform a miracle that night. He didn't cure Frank's voice. He didn't bring Ava back. He did something more important. He reminded Frank Sinatra of who he was. He showed him the king inside. The next morning, Frank didn't turn the gas back on. He took Dean's advice. He took the check. He bought a plane ticket to Hollywood. He walked into Harry Cohn's office and begged for the role of Maggio in From Here to Eternity. He offered to do it for almost no money. He got the part, and he poured every ounce of his pain into that role. When Maggio dies in that movie, it wasn't acting. It was Frank Sinatra killing the old version of himself. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The comeback was unprecedented. The records started selling. The movies started coming. He signed with Capitol Records and reinvented his sound. He became the chairman of the board. But he never forgot that night in New York. This is why the Rat Pack worked. It wasn't just guys drinking and partying. It was a brotherhood forged in fire. Frank was the leader, the organizer, but Dean was the anchor. Dean was the only man Frank considered his equal. Frank allowed Dean to mock him on stage because it was Dean's way of keeping him humble. It was Dean's way of saying, "Remember the kitchen floor, Frank. Remember who we really are." Every time Dean flicked ash on Frank's shoulder, he was grounding him, and Frank loved him for it. Years later, on stage in St. Louis, Frank stopped the show to introduce Dean. He put his arm around Dean and said, "This is my right arm. Without him, I couldn't swing." It was a public confession of the debt he could never repay. The tragedy is that while Dean saved Frank, Frank couldn't save Dean. Years later, when Dean's son died and Dean faded into grief, Frank tried everything. But Dean's darkness was different. When Deanmartin died in 1995, Frank Sinatra was destroyed. Frank simply said, "Dean was my brother, not by blood but by choice." Legend has it that in his final days, Frank, lost in dementia, would call out for Dean. He would forget Dean was gone. "Where's Dino? Is he coming over?" Maybe in his mind, he was back in that cold apartment in 1952, waiting for the knock on the door, waiting for the man who saved him one last time. We all need a Deanmartin in our lives. We all have moments where the darkness feels like the only option. And in those moments, we need a friend who will kick down the door, turn off the gas, pour us a drink, and tell us we're still worth something. Frank Sinatra was the greatest singer of all time, but he wouldn't have been if not for Deanmartin. Without Dean, we wouldn't have My Way. We wouldn't have the soundtrack of our lives. He saved the voice, and in doing so, he saved a piece of all of us. This is Deanmartin Legacy Stories. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share this with your Deanmartin, the friend who saved you when you were down. And subscribe for more untold stories of courage, class, and the secrets behind the Rat Pack. Until then, keep swinging, pal, and keep your friends close.